So I introduced this concept on Friday, but I just want to go a little deeper into how to read a phylogeny, how to make a phylogeny. All right, so if we're looking at the evolutionary history of a group of organisms, we would call that a phylogeny. Now, a phylogenetic tree is a way to graphically show this information. All right, so that's going to show the different relationships among the taxa, who's the ancestor, who's the descendant, who is related to whom. All right, now the most universal phylogenetic tree is the tree of life, and that depicts the relationships among all living organisms. All right, so this is an example of a tree of life, and there's a whole lot going on here. All right, and this is not even all encompassing the 1.5 million species that we have currently identified. But we're going to start very simply. All right, so we're just going to learn how to look at a phylogeny, how to read an evolutionary tree. All right, so if we look at our simple phylogeny over to the right here, right, we can kind of make some assumptions based on how it's laid out. So the further away an animal or an organism is from another organism, the less likely they are to be related, or the less related they are. All right, so a fish and a mouse are going to have a common ancestor that's further away than, say, maybe a mouse and a human. They might have a common ancestor that's closer in evolutionary history. Right? So a human and a rat are more related than the mouse and the fish. All right, so we can look at our image and say what's the furthest apart, and we know what two are least likely to be closely related. Now, if we look at our image here, we have these points on our phylogenetic tree called nodes. All right, these nodes are representing a common ancestor. All right, so if I look at the rat and the mouse here, all right, the common ancestor before the two species went through a speciation event and became two other species, all right, this was the common ancestor. This was the ancestor from which a rat and a mouse arose from. All right, so you can think of a phylogeny as it's like a family tree that you would make for your grandparents for Christmas. All right, so I want you to answer this question: who is the most closely related in both of these phylogenetic trees? All right, so take a second, pause the video if you need to, but try to figure out who is the most closely related. Right? Remember, think of that common ancestor. All right, so hopefully you paused the video, had some time to think about this here. All right, but who's the most closely related? Well, for both of these images, you should have said the rat and the mouse. All right, these are actually just the same phylogenetic trees. One node just happens to be spun around. All right, so graphically it's telling us the same information, but visually it looks a little different. All right, so rat and a mouse, they have a common ancestor that is for both of them, right? Now, a mouse and a human, they have a common ancestor as well, but it's a little further away on our evolutionary tree. So the rat and the mouse are most closely related to one another. Same for this tree, all right? Has the closest common ancestor, all right? The closest node to one another. All right, so again, I want you to take some time, pause the video, build your own phylogenetic tree, all right, using these organisms that I have shown you on the screen. All right, I want you to take some time, try to put them into a phylogenetic tree based on certain characteristics. Right? What characteristics you use are up to you. All right, so go ahead, pause the video, and do this now. All right, so hopefully you paused the video and gave that a shot. All right, so if we had done this in class, I'm sure we would see a bunch of different looking phylogenies. All right, and that's okay. Phylogenies are hypotheses. All right, and like any hypothesis, they are subject to revision and modification. All right, so let's look at two possible ways that you could have made a phylogenetic tree using these organisms. All right, so on the first one here, image A, right, we see we have this orca whale at the very bottom of our phylogenetic tree. On the second image here, we see that we have this orca whale closer to the hippo, right, because they both live in water. So who is the most closely related? All right, so is the whale most closely related, or is the common ancestor to all these other organisms? Right? Or does it just have a close common ancestor with the hippo, right, at this node here? And these are just images that explain exactly what I said, all right? Common ancestor here, right? So the common ancestor gave rise to the whale, but then also gave rise to all these other organisms. Or was the common ancestor here where it gave rise to the whale and the hippo? All right, so to answer those questions, let's look at how do we build the phylogeny, all right? The nitty-gritty details. So closely related taxa, all right, closely related species, should have the most traits in common, all right? So evolutionary relationships, they're only revealed by examining shared traits that are derived from a common ancestor. All right, so if we look at that rat and the mouse example again, it's likely that its common ancestor had fur, had a tail, had a lot of traits that were very similar to what the modern day mouse and the rat have. All right, so let's look at another phylogenetic tree here. All right, and this is where the term synapomorphy comes into play. So synapomorphy is a shared traits in two groups, and we really use this to define groups. All right, so these dashes, right, I have used to represent synapomorphies, and I've labeled them and they correspond to this list on the side. So if I look at tetrapods, all right, I know tetrapods have this common ancestor, right, that had lungs. All right, so that would be a synapomorphy for all these tetrapods, right? Lungs were developed here, and every organism since then on this phylogenetic tree has lungs, all right? Amniotes, all right, so starting at about the reptiles here, we see we have a common trait. We look at our list on the side, we see it's an amniotic egg, which is essentially an egg that allows for gas exchange. That could be in your stomach like a human, all right? We have a type of amniotic egg, or it could be like reptiles or snakes that actually lay these eggs, right? But they are having an amniotic egg is a synapomorphy for this group. All right, we can go even further and say all these mammals, all right, are characterized by having lactation, right? From this point onwards, every animal has the ability to lactate. And then finally, if we look at primates, right, monkeys and the lemurs on our phylogenetic tree here, we see that they have a synapomorphy of having opposable thumb and fingernails. All right, so synapomorphies, they really define out our groups when we're looking at a phylogenetic tree. Now, it's important to realize that phylogenetic trees, they can be really simple, such as the one we're looking at here. They're not going to include every single organism. All right, we saw the tree of life. We saw that that's way too complex. So often when we're looking at a phylogenetic tree, we're simplifying what we see. All right, the other term we want to think about when we're building a phylogenetic tree is parsimony. All right, so this is basically saying the simplest answer is probably correct. Right? The more complex an answer gets, the less likely it is correct. All right, so let's look at our trees again and think about parsimony. Right? We want to minimize the number of evolutionary changes in our tree, and the most parsimonious tree is going to be preferred. Right? So the tree that has the least amount of evolutionary changes. All right, so when we're looking at our tree, right, there's a feature that a lot of these organisms share. They are artiodactyls. All right, they are defined by having an ankle bone called the astragalus. All right, so it contributes to running ability. right? So they have this ankle bone. All right, so if we go back and look at our phylogenetic trees and try to map out where this ankle bone evolved at. All right, so we're going to map this out in our trees, and whenever we gain or lose the ankle bone, I'm going to put this red dash. All right, so if we look at image B here, we see that the oldest common ancestor here, which isn't even defined, all right, it developed the ankle bone. All right, so the camels, all these other organisms have the ankle bone, but the whale does not. Right, so we have to put another dash here to represent that we lost the ankle bone in this part of our phylogenetic tree. Versus if we had arranged our tree the other way, all right, with the whale on the bottom, we only have to put one dash in there to gain the ankle bone. All right, from this point on, we don't have to lose the ankle bone because all these organisms have it. All right, so which is the most parsimonious? All right, it's A, because we only had to gain or lose the ankle bone once. All right, versus twice in this one, and I realized that this should be moved over just a smidgen right there. All right, so let's look at making a phylogenetic tree again. All right, this time using only 3 different species. And we want to think about what are the possible trees that we can make for the relationships among these 3 species. So we're going to look at a human, a bat, and a bird, all right, and use the characteristics of producing milk, having hair, feathers, and wings. All right, so there's 3 possible trees that we could build. All right, so depending on how we decide to lay it out, there are only 3 ways that we could do so. Now it's our job to try to figure out which tree is the most parsimonious, all right, which requires the fewest evolutionary events. All right, let's start with the tree up top there. So feathers and wings, all right, birds, they have feathers and wings, so we're going to put dashes here indicating that this trait evolved. The common ancestor had feathers and wings that led to the bird. All right, now we're going to say that this common ancestor had to evolve the ability to produce milk and hair over here. All right, leading to the human and the bat. Now the bat also has wings. All right, so we're going to put another dash mark there to indicate that wings were also evolved after this common ancestor here, so that we would have a bat. All right, now notice wings is represented twice, right, in this tree. Everything else is represented once. If we look at this tree down in the corner here, all right, we can start by saying humans, bats, and birds. All right, we have to have milk and hair down here, right, because humans have to be able to produce milk and they have to have hair. Now in this branch, we can say that wings evolved. All right, bats and birds, they have wings. All right, now, but if we look at a bird, all right, they evolved the ability to have feathers, and they lost being able to produce milk and having hair. All right, they don't have hair, they don't have the ability to produce milk. All right, so notice on this one here, all right, we had to gain hair and milk right away. Then we had to lose them before a bird could have evolved. Now finally our one on the end here, all right, we have milk, hair, and wings. All right, we have to have evolved all of these to lead up to our organisms up there. All right, now humans, we have to have lost the ability to have wings. We don't have wings anymore. All right. Birds, again, we have to develop feathers, and we're going to lose the ability to have milk and hair. All right, now if we look at all of these and look at all these evolutionary changes that have had to happen in order to make these trees, we say that 5 changes happened here, 6 changes had to happen here, and 7 changes had to happen here. So the most parsimonious is going to be the one on top, all right? We only have to have 5 evolutionary changes, right? So if we had to put birds, humans, and bats in a phylogenetic tree using these traits, this would be the most reasonable phylogenetic tree to make because it's the most parsimonious. All right, so we're going to come back to this question on class on Monday. All right, but you can have some time to think about it over the weekend if you'd like. But I'm going to have you draw the most parsimonious tree showing the relationships among these 4 species.